This week started with high hopes that we may be near an end to the leakage from the damaged BP Deepwater Horizon Well. But then more complications, and the oil continued to flow. Tonight, what are the latest issues affecting our area? What's the situation with the new cap? What is the latest on the economic impact and the cleanup efforts? And when will the relief wells be ready? It's day 88. I'm Ernie Manoose, and this is Houston 8. "88 days since the BP Horizon explosion sent oil spilling into the Gulf. Over 12 weeks, more than 3 months. As July began, the refitted and converted Liberian supertanker, a Whale, begins skimming tests in Louisiana. It's expected to be able to separate up to 500,000 gallons of oil per day, storing the crude and returning the clean seawater to the Gulf. Day 74. Based on models of historic wind and water currents, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration predicts oil may come ashore in the Florida Keys and Miami. Day 77. Oil is reported at Rigolets in Louisiana, suggesting that the spill may soon make its way into Lake Pontchartrain. Day 80. United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit refuses to overturn the earlier New Orleans judge's drilling moratorium. The White House states it will issue a new moratorium. Day 83. The current cap is removed from the damaged well in preparation of a new, more secure cap, predicted to capture most of the escaping oil and eventually shut off the well. During the process, oil flows unabated. Day 84. The new cap is secured, hoping to finally stop the flow of oil. Yet the damage remains, with some estimates showing that the cleanup effort could take over 20 years. Joining us again tonight are Dr. Michelle Foss, Chief Energy Economist, Center of Energy Economics, University of Texas at Austin. Dr. Jeffrey Wozniak, Research Fellow at the Texas Research Institute for Environmental Studies, Sam Houston State University. And Dr. Don Van Nieuwenhuise, Director, Petroleum Geoscience Programs, University of Houston. Welcome back to all of you again. I want to start off with, right when we were doing the opening of the show, I heard you folks talking at the panel saying, I get confused at where we're at with this and that. There is so much coming on, even you guys sometimes have trouble following where we're at and what's what and what level of everything. What do we need to know at this point, and I'm going to start with you, Don, about where we're at. And, of course, this was pre-recorded, so things might have changed by the time people are viewing this. But where are we at this point with what's going on under the water?
Certainly. Right now they're at least testing the new cap, and they had 2 valves closed, and, of course, they had an issue with one of the valves that was leaking, and they've replaced the part that was leaking, and so they've resumed that test, and presumably the testing has gone quite well now, and they will have put themselves in a position to actually check the pressures for a good period of time. If the pressure starts to drop, they'll probably back off on the whole thing because that suggests there's a leak. If the pressure is maintained and they can build it up to around 8,700 psi, they'll probably hold it there for 48 hours to make sure that the well's integrity is completely intact and that they don't have anything to worry about.
Okay, let me briefly sum it up because I think all of us follow it maybe a little bit closer than some of our viewers. So what they have done is they've gone down to the broken end of the pipe that's coming out of the floor of the water.
Right.
They've put a new cap on it with the idea that if they can close that off, that will then seal it. So no more will come out.
Right.
In the process of it, the fear is that the pressure, though, that's building up, because it comes out at such a strong force, that as they close that off, if there's any breaks or fractures in the piping or underground, that would blow, and then we could have a catastrophic problem beyond what we're currently facing.
Exactly, correct? Because it's all about differential pressures, or the differences in pressures on the outside of the pipe versus the pressure inside the pipe. Outside the pipe, you're at seawater pressure, which is about 2,300 psi, pounds per square inch. Inside the pipe, you have about 8,700 pounds per square inch. And that's enough differential pressure to give you 6,000 or more psi, which is enough to rip a single pipe wide open. And at the very base of the well, or the top of the well, actually, you have several layers of pipe which can withstand that pressure because there's layers of it. But if it was to be jolted very quickly, then those pipes could break in a series, one after the other, and snap. And then you could have a catastrophic failure. And the good thing is they're doing this very slowly.
And that's what I think a lot of people don't understand. Why don't they just turn it off? They've got it, but they're slowly closing different valves so that they can reduce the pressure.
What they're doing
force
is
the pressure.
They're allowing the pressure to build slowly rather than rapidly, because rapidly it's like a hammer, but slowly it takes a little bit of time. And the analogy I use is that if you cut it off quickly, it's like a train running into a brick wall versus a train using its brakes. And of course, the results are completely different. But you go from whatever speed it is to zero. And you know, if you do it slowly, there's no damage. If you do it quickly, you can have catastrophic damage.
Okay, we'll talk more about that in just a second.
Sure.
Michelle, what I want to understand, too, even in the front setup piece, where are we with these moratoriums now? You think it's an easy question, but it's not.
No, it's not. And you know, I was going to point out that none of us are lawyers on this panel. And I think at this point in time, you almost have to be one to follow this stuff accurately and closely. But what happened was the original moratorium, of course, had a judicial decision, the original decision in June that found that it was not, you know, an applicable order. The federal government appealed. Of course, lots of entities are suing the federal government now at this stage of the game.
The moratorium is to stop offshore
for
exploration
a period of time.
For 6 months?
Yes, for a period of time. So the federal government appealed. It went to the Fifth Circuit Court in New Orleans.
Right, just to catch people up to it, in New Orleans, they said that was unconstitutional. They couldn't
July
do
8th.
it. And now then they appealed.
Yes, that was the June
right.
finding.
Then there was the appeal, and at the appeal is where we're at now, which was
the original. An oral hearing took place on July 8th, and a panel of 3 judges, 2 of which found that in fact the original decision was correct, and the moratorium was not a proper action. But they didn't stay the original moratorium, but the federal government has since, I think, vacated the original moratorium. This is where things get complicated. And then reissued a new moratorium, which is the one that is now currently being debated, which would stay in effect until November 30th.
How does this differ from the earlier one?
Well, it's supposedly a more narrow order. It has a termination date and other things related to that. But the fact of the matter is, the most important thing about all of this is that the risk and uncertainty has just continued to grow. And for companies that are, especially in the services industry, very cash flow dependent, if you can't see where your cash flow stream is heading, then you start to take action to mitigate that. And so the news has only continued to increase and indicate that companies are doing everything they can to move equipment out of the Gulf at a time when we have slack capacity all around the world. So it's not an easy thing to do, to put your rigs and people and other equipment to work in other locations, but that's what everyone is trying to do. And in between that, they're filing lawsuits against the U.S. government to try to bring some certainty or order to the chaos. And in the middle of all of that, the Presidential Commission chaired by William K. Riley and former Senator Bob Graham met and had their first hearing in New Orleans, and then toured the region and concluded, as many of us have, that the economic effects of the moratorium are actually worse than the spill, because we are having trouble separating economic effects from the spill from a recession when it comes to all of the ancillary regional businesses, tourism and recreational fishing and all of that sort of stuff. All of that was going to be off this summer regardless. And for many of these communities, as people have been trying to point out, more of the revenue for coastal communities has come from the offshore oil and gas industry than from commercial fisheries, which have been, a fairly
one argument that I hear brought up,
time.
and I think we might have even brought it up here before. If an airliner goes down, it doesn't shut down the airline industry. people tend to look at what happened with that airline, that aircraft, and they look and they see what went wrong, what can we do better in the future. Why isn't that approach being used in the oil arena?
Well, people are making that argument constantly. Now, you have different viewpoints from the viewpoint of perhaps someone like Jeff who can respond, or others who are really concerned about environmental integrity in the region. You might be risking another spill. But we have an incident that is the first incident in many, many years of this type of activity. And furthermore, doing a little research, this same rig, the Deepwater Horizon, which was damaged and sunk and is at the bottom of the ocean, drilled 2 very successful wells, both by the same company as operator, BP, last year, one of which, Tiber, was a 3 billion barrel discovery. Both of the wells in the 2 fields, Tiber and Cascada, were more complicated and more complex than the one that they were drilling, Macondo. Things have to be sorted out. The onion has to be peeled the right way. And I think what's happened over the 12 weeks is that the arguments have simply grown more vocal that we're not peeling the onion the right way.
Right.
And so a lot of on the political economic side, a lot of the struggle is how do you peel that onion? Who's doing what? Who's in control? Who's getting, who's managing that process of investigating?
But that makes me think then even if Airline X was running the plane that went down, and it turned out Airline X was corrupt and they knew they were doing wrong, Airlines Y and Z still wouldn't really be affected. We would be looking at who caused what with that particular crash, instead of condemning the entire airline industry. And not that I'm taking either side, I'm just trying to understand this mentality as we go forward.
And I think not taking either side and just explaining for viewers the range of arguments, this is exactly what people are trying to deal with, is how do you perceive risk? We have a problem with that. Everyone is learning all over again how we perceive risk in the United States and around this kind of industry and this sort of activity is part of the complication. People don't see major oil spills. This is a good thing that we don't see major oil spills happen a lot. But when you don't see major oil spills happen a lot, and they do happen, then everyone freaks out, frankly. So there's a lot of that sort of thing going on, and it's a large one, and we're struggling to understand all of the dimensions of it from an operational point of view, an economic and social and political point of view, and an environmental point of view.
And
so this
perfectly
is,
said, because now we'll go over to Jeff on that one.
Yeah.
Well, actually, can I interject an observation and a bit of a question, actually? So, correct me if I'm wrong, but the moratorium is meant to take some time, understand response procedures, drilling procedures in deep water. We're into our 3rd month of this event now, halfway through a 6-month moratorium. With the judicial acts and work that's going on, that's one thing. But do we see a presidential commission, or is there a group that's actually starting to look into these response programs that this moratorium is being set up to do? Because if we would just continue to move forward with that, we'd be halfway through the process already.
Well, as I said, the Presidential Commission has started work. They had their first hearing in New Orleans. There is a separate effort because no one was happy with how the Presidential Commission came together. So Congress weighed in, and one of the members of Congress, Brasso from Wyoming, proposed a separate commission that would be a bipartisan commission and with, sort of a different context. It's not clear what that group is supposed to do or who's going to appoint people or whatever. And, of course, there have been separate hearings and separate investigations and separate things going on, and a general sense that it's unwieldy, and a growing sense, I think, and actually it's been interesting talking with people from outside of the United States who are looking at this and saying, well, if this happened to us, our industry and our government wouldn't be fighting each other. They'd be at the table trying to work on solutions. And there's sort of a general, attitude that we're not doing that here, when, of course, in fact, there is a mix of people at the MMS command centers who are working very hard together to try to solve the problem. But the headline news on the struggle over the moratoria, the various lawsuits and pieces of litigation that are emerging around this, and separate efforts in Congress to impose longer-term restrictions, or in effect what would result in longer-term restrictions on drilling before there are facts and data and evidence. And I think that's what's causing so much of the irritation.
Okay, I've got to get some environmental stuff going here now. One of the things we say in our setup package is the fact that it could take up to 20 years. Estimates are coming in to clean up this damage. What's the realistic estimate here, and what are we talking about?
Well, 20 years actually might be conservative. You really don't know, and I don't think anyone can conclusively say it will take X amount of time for this to be done and for the systems to get back to where they were, because when we see damage to ecosystems, you never really get back to that original ecosystem state, the way that system functions. You never really get back to ground zero. You can restore, you can modify, and you can mitigate, but it's always to a compromised system state, if you will. And it's really going to vary based on where you are, because I think of it as sort of the open water, the intertidal beach area, and then as you move further inland into the estuaries, and each one of those systems is going to respond differently. At the same time, we know more information about those coastal wetlands than we do the deeper water areas. Interestingly enough, in the Gulf, we actually do know a fair bit, and a fair bit of research has been done on a lot of the cold water seeps, the cold water coral areas that we see from about 1,000 meters and inland. There's actually been a fair amount of work done in that type of ecosystem. What will be interesting is, based on that data set that we have in place right now, is when we move a year or a decade or 2 decades down the road, like you mentioned, to look at how the system responds. Initial data will come in and it'll tell us what the impact is, if there's a die-off, if certain species productivity might increase, whatever it may be. What you have to bear in mind, if in a decade or 2 decades or 3 decades down the road, is each community, each population, each ecosystem is going to oscillate around its steady state. There's going to be periods where it will dip down and production might go lower, species might die off. As one species might die off, another might move into the niche that was left, and you might see a different species increase. So it's going to be an ebb and flow. It's going to be a cyclic process, almost like a yo-yo coming and going. The trick is, through more time, that oscillation starts to smooth out and you end up getting back to normalcy, if you will.
Help me understand. We see a lot of images that flash across the news, and I hope we've been responsible when we show our images as we move forward, but that seem to be these stereotypic images of animals drenched in oil and all that. How realistic is the situation there? What are we seeing, and how is it being reported, do you feel?
Well, those images are powerful, and it's amazing how an oiled bird can sort of leave an indelible mark, you know, on your soul. I mean, it is what it is, and that image is real, and that is going on. You do also see, on the other side of that equation, the reports of pelicans, oiled pelicans which were taken in, de-oiled, and we actually just had a release a couple weeks ago down at the Aransas National Wildlife Refuge that you earlier mentioned. So it is realistic. It is occurring. I personally wish I saw more pictures, not of fauna, but of the actual system, of looking at beaches, of looking at the oiling, looking at how heavy that oiling is on those beaches. We're talking thousands and thousands of acres of land, and it's not going to be consistent oiling across that land. So I think we should take a road trip and go down there and actually take a look and actually see it, because if you're not first person standing on that wetland, the pictures don't do you justice, in my opinion. So it is realistic, but unless you're there, I think it's not the same.
I have a question for Jeff. We've talked about this before, which is what actually has been disturbed, because we've been looking at the NOAA maps. We had seen a news report that actually only about 60 miles of coastline is really affected in terms of actually being oiled. What is the number? Well, we have tar balls floating up in different places, but in terms of actual, more heavily damaged acreage, what is it?
The number is probably a lot bigger than 60 miles, because bear in mind, you're not thinking of a linear mile. The coastline is varied. It has inlets in and out. In a 50-foot linear stretch, you might have a quarter mile of edge. You see numbers floating around about the 60 miles, for example. But that 60 miles, even if it just was 60 miles, that is the most productive portion of these coastal wetlands. That is the ecotone, the area that brings together the terrestrial uplands and the marine. So it's the area that's of the most interest.
Okay, we are going to run out of time, as we always do. So there's one thing that I think I want to toss out here and hear all of your opinions on. As they close off the cap, and once it is sealed, how long do we know that that can hold? How long before the relief wells get there? And if there is a rupture, how do we speculate what would happen? What would come from that? What would it do to the water? What would be the environmental impact? What would, in an estimate, would you say?
Well, it would just return things back to where they are right now, where we have...
Or worse.
Or worse, even, yes.
And when we talk about or worse, that's what I'm trying to understand. Right now we have an exit point.
Right.
But if there is a larger rupture, right, what are we talking? You hear rumors out there of floor collapse or things coming up.
Well,
what's the realistic?
The floor could collapse, and that is more of an issue with trying to contain it, because then you would be unable to contain it very well at all, because you'd have a large hole in the ground, essentially.
Right. So what happens?
But the flow would be essentially the same. So you might see something on the order of 35 to 45,000 barrels uncontrolled for the remainder of the period until they are able to kill the wells. Now, right now the wells are in very good position to do the kill operations. They're less than 5 feet away laterally, and they only have about 30 feet to drill before they set the last string of casing that they want to set. So they're very close to being able to penetrate. And of course,
so even once you cap the well, we still need the relief wells to go in there.
You need the relief well because the well system itself, the whole entire well bore itself, has got probably some weak points in it and maybe some fractures that are leaking subsurface, well below the surface, where it's not a real threat to the environment, but you don't want to have opened avenues of oil escape into other formations or layers of rocks in the earth that could find a fault, for example, in the rock and sort of leak its way to the surface. So it's really critical that you seal the whole thing. And to do that, you fill it up with cement from the bottom up, and that's what they're going to do. Completely fill this with cement, and then it'll be actually more secure than the area next to it without a well in it at all, because the cement will be a much tighter seal than just the natural rock formations.
From the environmental point of view, what are your folks' concerns right now?
Well, one thing, and just listening to Don's response made me think of is when they're working on this kill procedure, they stop producing the oil that is currently flowing. When they're putting the cap on, you stop that production of the oil, and you get back to that initial flow that we saw in the beginning. And I just thought we're sort of desensitized to that. And it's all of a sudden we're back to the full bore flow, and it's almost, well, it's okay because we are moving towards the end point, but it just amazes me. Anytime you look at that flow coming out of that wellhead, as Don said, it's a freight
pops
train.
in my head. Well, anytime you make an omelet, you got to break some eggs. So, if they're this close to capping it, to stopping it, wouldn't we rather have a day or two, or as it's turning out now, almost a week of oil flow at full capacity to think that then it's going to be done, as opposed to 8-10 more weeks of it coming out and trying to collect it and all of that, isn't it?
Yes. I agree. If it's a means to an end, by all means, yes.
Right. But I understand your point. We've seen so much of this at this point.
The trick of it is it's not going to end.
Yeah, but actually the way it is right now, the flow should be ending fairly soon. And the other thing is, one of the things that they needed to do the kill successfully was to have a secure cap on there to give some back pressure, because it's hard for people to understand, but the pressure of the water above it's not enough to hold the mud and the cement in place completely. They put that cap on top. It ensures that the kill procedure will work. It adds another 10% of assurance to an 80-85% assurance.
Argument I've heard people saying is, why didn't they do this first? Why wasn't this the first thing that they approached?
Very good question, and the answer is they didn't have the equipment yet. They had to build the equipment. The whole issue with a lot of these approaches is they pulled what they could off the shelf as fast as they could and threw it at the problem and tried to actually contain as much as they could as fast as they could. Also, these different steps that they've taken, if they did some of them in the wrong order, they might not be able to try the other ones, and one might not work, as we've seen. And of course, this last cap, the design of it actually was modified based on the results they found from some of the previous steps. So they've done a very careful and deliberate stepwise process to get where they are today, and people just don't really understand that, but it's true.
Real quick cleanup effort, too, that we haven't talked much about. When we talk about, they're doing what they can in the order they can, and we hear these reports that there are new separators out there that can separate the water. We've talked about a whale. Things are not going as well. The reports come in that people aren't being as proactive from either the government or the industry end. truth?
I think that's absolutely true. I think a lot of people are willing and able to get in on it and help out, but a lot of the equipment was not brought online as fast as it could have been.
You see every day more and more skimmers are added to the fleet. They're doing the best, I think, to get out there and physically stop the oil from getting there. Again, I've said this before, I think what we're going to have to look to is after the oil is shut off and we come to that end point, will those efforts continue? And just as you move down the road a decade, 2 decades, will the focus still be on the natural systems?
Yeah.
Michelle?
Well, I think the one thing that everybody knows as of now is that where we were is not acceptable in terms of having equipment and systems in place. But you also, this is hard to test in a lab. Yeah. That's the one dilemma here, and that I think everybody needs to understand. I mean, this is really hard to replicate in terms of trying to direct systems and things that you should have in place in order to prevent something like this. So still 99% of the effort needs to be, don't ever let it happen. Have the right technologies in place to avoid this kind of thing in the first place.
That's the word where we're going to end.
Backstop.
Okay, and the backstop have it. Thank you, gentlemen and lady, for joining us. Mm-hmm. Now, each week we invite you to visit our home online at HoustonPBS.org. Simply click on the local programs bar, pick Houston 8. You can join our online community. Read about the guests, learn more about the topic, share your thoughts and ideas, and even suggest questions that we might ask during upcoming episodes. Remember, information posted on our website may be used on air, so keep that in mind when submitting. That does it for us again tonight. Thank you for joining us. I'm Marie Manous. Good night.